Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of a series that we haven't looked at in quite some time, but it is one of the biggest series on the channel, Rivals. And for those who have never watched an episode before, this is where we pitch certain vehicles in head-to-head showdowns, sometimes two, sometimes more. On this occasion, three cars, three of the same car technically of course, but three different generations of Porsche, the Porsche 911. Now, we have the early 2000s, the later 2000s, and much more recently from 2016, three different versions of the Porsche GT3, essentially. So, we're going to find out how they compare. But for this particular Rivals match, I'm kind of comparing them in two different ways. Because as many of you know, I often like to compare the cars in their fully tuned form when it comes to the spec, because that gives you a better idea of what that car's ultimate potential is if you want to buy one and fully tune it. However, to make the comparison itself more accurate, I've tuned all three cars for the lap itself to the peak of N400. So they all three have the lowest possible weight, around 440 horsepower, and sport soft tyres, to really show you how they do stack up under equal conditions. So, with all of that being said, let's first of all take a look at the oldest of the three, the 2001 996 generation 911. Now, this particular 911, as I touched on before in its own dedicated review, is easily the one of the three which is the most happy-go-lucky. It's nowhere near as focused, it's not as aggressive, it's not as sharp as either of the cars that would come after it, but that's kind of expected. That would be the case for a lot of cars that get a facelift. If you compare the most recent Viper, for instance, like an ACR, to the original RT10, of course it feels softer in comparison back then, or an older Corvette, for instance, will often feel less advanced, because it isn't as advanced. That's the whole point of progress, of course. Now, in the case of this one, the single biggest advantages, which technically isn't single because I'm going to say two of them, but the two biggest advantages then of this 911 are the price, which is fantastic. 140 grand is really good. But secondly, it's the only one of the three which can be detuned to N300. Both of the other two can only go as low as N400, and that's a very important thing to bear in mind. Not only for Blue Moon Bay, but also for stuff like circuit racing, online lobbies. That's a very good advantage to have, and I will tell you right now, that is a dominant N300 car. It's difficult to find a better all-rounder than the Porsche in N300. In terms of how it handles compared to the other two on equal footing in N400 though, it's not too surprisingly the slowest of the three. The ultimate lap time is a 2:11.5, which is not bad, of course, for N400 with sport softs, but ultimately it is the slowest of the three, not by as much as you might assume though, given that the footing of the tuning is fairly equal, so that does give the car an advantage there in comparison to its age. So overall, it has some advantages, but of course it's not going to be the quickest of the three. What then about the 997 shape model? Well, the 997 is, I would say, probably my favourite, actually, of these three cars. I remember, for me personally, back in the day, around 2006, 2007, I was reading a Top Gear magazine issue where they went to the Isle of Man with a number of different cars, like the Ariel Atom, I think, was one of them. The Caparo T1 may have been one. The Porsche GT3 RS in yellow, and a Renault Megane R26, and it was a number of cars which I really loved, but it was that occasion where I first really took notice of this 997 GT3, because it's probably my personal favourite iteration of the Porsche GT3. To me, everything just fell into place. It's more simple than the newer one, which we'll get to in a second, of course. It feels more pure, more focused, whereas the newer one, it feels more electronically helped, kind of like a Nissan GT-R kind of vibe, which that kind of feel used to be reserved for the Turbo in particular, whereas this one was always the more hardcore version, whereas now the GT3 kind of feels like a Turbo in its own right. This one though, as I said, is easily my favourite of the three. It's not the quickest, that's for sure, and it's not that much quicker actually than the early 2000s model. As I said, that one did a 2:11.5, this one did a 2:10.2, or just under, so that's pretty close between the two cars. Now of course, they're both N400, so they should be close, but it is interesting to note just how close they can be, given that this one feels a lot faster than that. The only disadvantage to this one, I would say, is the brakes. They're a little bit weak compared to the older car. The older car definitely has more stopping power, which is ironic. Again, we could do with having racing brakes, really, but that considered, of course, none of the cars can have it, so it's still fair to some degree. This one, though, definitely my favourite of the three. It's not as nannying, I would say, as the newer one. It feels more hardcore, more aggressive, more sharp, and I like that. That's kind of what the car should be about, and it definitely delivers. Plus, the price tag is only 20 grand more. It's 160,000, which is still fantastic value. What then finally, though, about the original, the newest of the three, but the one which we already had in the game from day one? Well, that car, of course, is the 991 generation Porsche GT3 RS, the car that we, as I said, had in the game straight off the get-go, and immediately everyone wanted to check out what it was like to drive along with the other Porsches, and we very quickly noticed how OP it was. In fact, this particular Porsche was, if I recall correctly, the first tune setup I ever did on YouTube for GT Sport. It's still one of the most popular ones and one of the most successful ones based on feedback that I've ever done. Tons of people have won races with it and really enjoyed the tune. I've altered my tune for this one. I would say improved it even more, but of course that's a comparison on its own. In terms of how the car is overall, it's a lot heavier than the other two, but there's the thing, and this is why I said it's like the Nissan GT-R. It is heavier, but the reason why a car like this becomes heavier is not because they just make it heavier for the sake of it. It's packed with more technology, more safety technology, but also more tech in particular that aids you as the driver, makes the car more efficient in its performance, in its handling, in its trackability, and you can definitely feel that. Now, the payoff is that it feels like it does a lot of the work for you, and personally I don't like that as much. For me, that's why I love the 997 so much, because it's the happy medium between the two. This one does all of the work for you. The older one is way too fun and slippery and slidey. The 997 is in between. It's sharp, it's focused. But if you're looking for the fastest, well, of course it's this. Look at the comparison in lap time with a 2:08. That's a lot faster than the other two, given that it's, again, N400 with the same kind of tyres. So the lap times speak for themselves, and they pretty much pan out the way that you'd expect them to in terms of ranking. But what though in terms of the spec, especially in particular when fully tuned? Well, let's find out. Now, as I said, I believe early on in the video, I wanted to compare the specs in a different way to the lap times, because the laps are all N400, but for the specs, I wanted to show you guys what these cars are capable of when you actually use a ton of mileage points to fully upgrade them, so that if you haven't bought one, or if you haven't fully tuned one, you can see how they really do stack up. So, first of all, we have the price. That point is of course going to the original, because the biggest single downside, and arguably the only straight up downside of the newest one, is it's so much more expensive. 250,000 credits is way more than the other two, like 90 grand more than the nearest car, over 100 grand more than the older one. So of course that point goes to the original. It's way cheaper, basically half the price or close enough. In terms of class comparisons though, this one can be iffy. How do I score the points? Is it which one can go highest? Which one can go lowest? Well, as I've said before, the way that I divvy up a point based on the N classes now is, to make it a true comparison, I like to give the point to the car that actually has the most range, because that means it's the most useful. So in this occasion, despite the fact that the older one can go down to N300, which is very good, it only spans N300 to N500, fully tuned. Then N400 to N600 for the middle model, but of course I have to give the point then to the newest model, the 991 shape, which can go all the way down to N400, but all the way up to N700. That is better range than the other two, so of course I'm giving that one the point. As far as engine capacity, well, of course, as I always say in these episodes, the biggest engine is not the best in real life. It just doesn't work that way, of course, but as I've said before as well, this is kind of a top trumps mentality. more for the fun of it than anything else really, so for the sake of the point we give it to the biggest engine, which on this occasion is the newest car. It's not that much bigger, of course, 3.6 litre, then a 3.8, then a 4, so it's pretty close between all of them, so we're giving it to the new car. As far as power though, I mean, look at it. Of course, the newest car is way more powerful, but it is interesting to see how each car jumps up by about 100 horsepower more. In terms of potential, 538, then 638, then just under 100 horsepower more, with 736 horsepower peak from this newest car. In terms of torque, surprise surprise, or not really, especially from a larger capacity, of course, the newer car is the best. Again, not a huge difference between them all though, 100 pound-feet separates the lowest from the highest, but still, the same kind of graduation that you'd expect between the three. As far as weight though, as I alluded to when we looked at the car on its own, the lightest of the three by a decent enough margin is the older one, which is not surprising at all. 1161 kilos is a decent amount lighter, well, what, 30-40 kilos-ish lighter than the 997 shape, which itself is not overly heavy, but that's even better compared to the newest one. 1235 kilos seems heavy in comparison, but of course the reality is that's not heavy at all. That's like rally car weight, and lower than a rally car in some cases. So of course, because the power is so much higher and the weight is higher but not by a ridiculous amount, the newest model does also win the point for horsepower per ton, even though the oldest one of course got the point for weight. So overall, this is one of the relatively rare occasions where the car that has the most points on paper actually is also the fastest, and I think that's one of the good things about comparing cars that come from the same lineage, because usually when it works out that the car with the least points wins, which happens a lot more often than you'd think, it's because the cars are different, you know, Subaru versus Mitsubishi, those kind of scenarios. Whereas when you do compare the same model but different versions of it, older ones compared to new, this is basically what you'd expect to happen. You would hope that the newer cars would get more points and become faster and faster. That's kind of the point. So on this occasion, not too surprising. The surprising stuff is more, for me, that the difference in lap time was fairly minimal between the 996 and the 997, despite how radically different they feel in comparison to each other. But overall, that means that, of course, our winner with 5 points is the newest Porsche with class, engine size, power, torque and horsepower per ton. Then with 2 points, it's the oldest one, the 996 from 2001, with both weight and price. Plus, bear in mind, that class can go down to N300. As I said, that is a good advantage to have. But for me, my favourite of the three, unfortunately gets nothing. It doesn't get the best or the worst lap. It doesn't get the most points. In fact, it actually has no points where it's better than the other two. So it still kind of turned out the way that I alluded to, because my favourite of the three was the worst. So an interesting matchup, not too surprising in terms of the outcome, but I will say all three of these are fantastic cars to go for, and they all do have their specific advantages. The older one has, as I said, that N300 advantage and the price advantage. The 997 also has the price advantage over the newer one by a significant amount, and I personally like the handling on it the most. But of course the newer one has all of the specs, the class range, and it is the fastest overall. So an interesting matchup. Of course we will take a look at other matchups in due time on the channel, but for now, as always, thanks for watching.